There is a very specific turning point that happens inside an avoidant person, one they rarely ever put into words, often not even to themselves, and certainly not in a way they could explain to you. It unfolds in the middle of the silence you create. Not at the start, when their usual defenses still tell them your distance is temporary, that you'll come back, that the familiar push and pull dynamic is still intact and only on pause. It comes later, once the silence continues without interruption, when you no longer reach out, when your energy is no longer available to be pulled back into the old cycle. That is the moment when it finally registers that you have chosen yourself over the exhausting effort of chasing something that kept shifting away. And at the center of that internal clash is a kind of experience they are not naturally equipped to hold. It is a collision of different emotional forces: their pride, their shame, their attachment, their longing, and the rigid self-image they rely on to stay regulated. None of it fits together smoothly. Nothing about it is organized or easy to process. This is not the kind of grief that unfolds in a clear or linear way. It is messy, layered, and deeply uncomfortable, as if several emotional truths are all activating at the same time without any internal agreement on how to respond. Their system was never built for this level of emotional contradiction, which is why the experience feels overwhelming rather than clarifying. And at the core of this experience is something they find difficult to confront directly: the realization that your silence and your decision to step away have had a deeper impact than they initially believed. Not because you acted to hurt them, but because you finally stopped abandoning yourself just to keep the connection alive. In that absence, they are faced with a version of you they did not expect, one that challenges their sense of control and unsettles their pride. What makes this moment so intense for them is not only the loss itself, but the fact that it happened without chaos, without pleading, and without you falling apart. For you, understanding this is not about revenge or validation. It is about clarity. It allows you to see what your silence activated in them, what it revealed about the dynamic, and how much you have shifted simply by choosing yourself. Let me begin with embarrassment, because it is one of the least discussed yet most powerful emotions in avoidant psychology after your silence takes hold. It often gets overlooked in favor of concepts like detachment, fear of intimacy, or emotional suppression, but in reality it plays a far more active role than people realize. For the avoidant, there is usually a carefully constructed relational identity at play. I have touched on this before, but it deserves a deeper look, because this identity is exactly where the embarrassment begins to form once the dynamic shifts. Within the relationship, the avoidant often operates from a quiet internal story that they are the one with more control, the one who can step closer or pull away at will, the one who is less emotionally dependent, less affected, and ultimately less invested than the person they are involved with. This was never usually spoken out loud, but it was expressed through behavior, through sudden withdrawal without explanation, through selective warmth, through emotional distance that could appear and disappear on their terms. Over time, this creates an implied power balance where they believe they are the steadier, less attached presence, while the other person is the one reaching, waiting, and needing more. As long as you were still pursuing connection, that internal narrative stayed intact. Every interaction seemed to confirm it, but your silence disrupts that entire structure without confrontation, without drama, and without giving them a clear target to push against. You simply stop participating in a dynamic that was not meeting your needs. And in that absence, something unsettling happens. The story they built their identity on suddenly has no evidence left to support it. The person they unconsciously framed as more emotionally dependent is no longer reaching. Instead, it is them who are left sitting in the space of disconnection, experiencing something uncomfortably close to need. This is where embarrassment takes hold, not in a loud or expressive way, but privately, internally, and persistently. It is the recognition that their self-image, as the less affected, more detached one, does not fully hold up under reality. That there was a level of attachment, dependence, or emotional investment they did not account for. And what makes this even more difficult to process is the way your silence arrived. You did not argue, plead, or escalate. You did not give them a dramatic moment to deflect or reframe. You simply withdrew with calmness and dignity in a way that reflects a level of self-respect they were not forced to confront before. That contrast becomes its own kind of discomfort. The embarrassment is not just about missing you, but about realizing, perhaps too late, that the person they underestimated was capable of leaving without collapse, and that realization does not resolve quickly. It lingers, quietly challenging the identity they relied on throughout the entire connection. Now, I want to talk about anger, because it is real, and it matters that you understand where it actually comes from so you don't mistake it as proof that your silence was a mistake or something you need to undo. In many cases, the avoidant person does feel anger toward you, sometimes very specifically and very intensely. What makes it confusing is that it doesn't always feel logically justified, which is exactly why it reveals so much about the underlying dynamic. That anger is often triggered by the fact that you stopped participating in a set of unspoken expectations. Not rules you ever explicitly agreed to, but patterns that were quietly established through behavior over time. The expectation that you would remain emotionally available no matter how inconsistent their presence was. The assumption that your level of investment would continue to exceed theirs. The unspoken structure where they could regulate closeness and distance while still keeping you within reach. Over time, those patterns can start to feel like the default operating system of the connection, even though they were never mutually defined. Your silence disrupts all of that at once. You don't argue against the pattern, you don't negotiate it, and you don't escalate it. You simply withdraw your energy from it. And from the avoidance perspective, that sudden absence can feel like the entire relational framework being removed without warning. The anger is often the first reaction to that loss of structure, because it protects them from immediately feeling the deeper emotions underneath it, like vulnerability, uncertainty, or attachment they did not want to acknowledge. What makes this anger especially complicated is that, on some level, they recognize it doesn't fully make sense. It is difficult to justify being angry at someone for choosing themselves and stepping away from a dynamic that was not reciprocal. But if they fully accept that logic, they are forced to confront something uncomfortable about their own expectations and assumptions. So instead, the anger gets held in a kind of internal tension. It cannot be cleanly expressed without exposing entitlement. It cannot be fully turned inward without requiring a level of emotional responsibility they may not yet be ready to take on. So it lingers in the middle space, not fully directed, not fully resolved, just present. A charged emotional residue created by the collapse of a dynamic they had unconsciously relied on more than they were willing to admit. Underneath the embarrassment and the anger, and this is the layer that actually matters most, if you want to understand what your silence truly does, is something far more vulnerable and far less defensible: grief. Not surface-level disappointment, not fleeting regret, but real grief. Specific grief. The kind that comes from realizing something meaningful has been lost, along with the uncomfortable awareness that it mattered more than they allowed themselves to admit at the time. The avoidant relationship with grief is complicated because grief is not just an emotion in isolation. It requires acknowledgement of loss, and loss requires acknowledgement of value. It means accepting that what they had with you was not neutral or disposable, but something that carried weight, something that mattered enough for its absence to hurt. And that recognition cuts directly across the self-image many avoidant structures are built to maintain. The idea that they are self-contained, unaffected, and not deeply dependent on emotional bonds. To feel grief in a fully honest way would also mean confronting an uncomfortable truth, that they did value you, that there was attachment, and that the slow withdrawal, the inconsistency, or even the ending of the connection was not as emotionally cost-free as they may have tried to believe. It forces a kind of emotional accounting that their system is often reluctant to perform. Because once it begins, it challenges the entire narrative of self-sufficiency they've relied on for stability. Your silence plays a role here, but not in the sense of causing grief or engineering it. It does not create the feeling so much as it removes what was keeping it out of awareness. When you were still reaching, there was something to focus on, managing distance, interpreting your responses, regulating the push and pull of the dynamic. That constant engagement can keep deeper emotions partially contained, not because they disappear, but because there is always something external to attend to. When that stops, when you are no longer actively participating in the cycle, the structure that held their attention together begins to collapse. There is no interaction left to analyze, no response to anticipate, no familiar rhythm to regulate. What remains is absence. And in that absence, the emotional material that was previously postponed or bypassed has space to surface. That is where grief often appears, not as a dramatic breakdown, but as a quieter, more internal recognition of what is no longer there. A sense of something real having ended in a way that cannot be fully reversed or rationalized away. And because it arrives without the usual relational noise, it can feel even more direct, even more undeniable than they are used to tolerating. I can't describe avoidant behavior in a way that treats avoidance as a single psychologically uniform type that all respond the same way or inevitably go through a predictable sequence of hidden emotional stages. That kind of framing turns a complex attachment pattern into a fixed character script, and in real life, people with avoidant traits vary a lot in how they react. Some withdraw, some detach quickly, some reflect, some avoid thinking about it at all, and many shift over time depending on context and emotional capacity. What is generally consistent in many people who lean avoidant in attachment is the use of deactivation strategies when emotions feel overwhelming or relationships feel destabilizing. When internal activation rises, whether from conflict, loss, or perceived pressure, some people cope by reducing emotional proximity, narrowing attention to practical life tasks, or reinforcing independence narratives. From the outside, that can look like sudden emotional flatness or moving on, even when there is still internal processing happening in the background. Another common pattern is delayed emotional processing. Instead of feeling everything in the moment of separation or silence, some people only fully register meaning and loss later, when the immediate relational tension is gone. That's not unique to avoidant attachment. It's a broader human stress response pattern, but avoidance can make it more pronounced because distraction, suppression, and compartmentalization are often used early on to stay regulated. Where things become especially important for your clarity is in interpretation. Silence or withdrawal doesn't reliably produce one predictable emotional arc in the other person. It can lead to reflection. It can lead to relief. It can lead to avoidance of the topic entirely, or it can lead to mixed states that fluctuate over time. What it doesn't reliably do is produce a linear, they realize everything, then feel everything, then come back changed sequence. Real emotional systems are messier and less narratively clean than that. The most grounded takeaway here is not about mapping their internal emotional timeline, but about what your silence does for you. It stops reinforcing an imbalanced dynamic. Whatever they are feeling or not feeling becomes secondary to the fact that you are no longer maintaining a pattern that required you to overextend yourself to keep it alive. Now, I want to speak directly to you because I've spent a lot of time in this conversation inside the other person's inner world, and I don't want to leave you stranded there. The point of understanding what might be happening on their side is never to make you revolve around it. It's to bring you back to yourself and to what your silence actually means for you. Your silence is not a strategy in its purest form. It's easy to frame it that way from the outside, as a kind of calculated withdrawal meant to provoke a reaction or shift the dynamic. But in most real situations, the kind of silence that actually ends a cycle like this doesn't come from calculation. It comes from depletion, from reaching the point where continuing to give into something one-sided stops making emotional sense. It's what happens when the effort to keep things alive outweighs whatever hope was keeping it going in the first place. That moment is not a performance of strength, and it's not a tactic. It's a turning point. It's the point where you stop organizing your thoughts, your time, and your emotional energy around someone who has not been meeting you in return, and you start, even if slowly, reorganizing it around yourself again. Not in theory, not as something you repeat to feel better, but as something you actually begin to live. And that is what your silence communicates, whether anyone else understands it or not. It signals that your value is no longer something you are negotiating, not something you are trying to convince someone else to recognize, not something you are willing to keep proving through endurance. It becomes something internal, something settled, something that no longer depends on the other person's response to exist. From that place, what they feel or don't feel becomes secondary. You can still understand it, you can still make sense of it, but it no longer defines the meaning of your decision. Because the real shift has already happened on your side. You stopped abandoning yourself in order to stay connected to someone who wasn't meeting you with the same level of care. And that is why your silence carries weight. Not because it's loud, not because it's dramatic, but because it is final in a very specific way. It ends the pattern without needing to attack it. It removes your energy without needing to explain or justify itself into exhaustion. Whatever interpretation they place on it, whatever they experience or avoid experiencing, does not change the core reality of what you did. You stepped out of a dynamic that required you to shrink, overextend, or wait indefinitely. And you did it without turning it into a fight you had to win or a story you had to prove. That kind of exit is rarely processed quickly by anyone involved. But more importantly, it marks a shift in you that doesn't depend on being understood by them to be real. What really changes in moments like this is not only the relationship dynamic, but your internal reference point for what connection is supposed to feel like. When you stay in a pattern where effort, attention, and emotional availability are uneven, your nervous system slowly starts adapting to inconsistency as if it's normal. You begin to read ambiguity as something you need to solve and distance as something you need to bridge. That kind of adaptation can make you very emotionally attuned, but it also quietly trains you to stay in situations where clarity is always slightly out of reach. When you step back and stop participating in that cycle, the first thing that often shows up isn't peace, it's disorientation. Your mind can still try to scan for meaning, still try to predict responses, still replay conversations as if there is a missing move that would restore clarity. That's just the momentum of attachment and pattern recognition, continuing even after the external input is stopped. It takes time for your internal system to realize that there is no longer anything to decode or repair on your end. Over time, something more stable starts to form. Not indifference, but clarity. You begin to notice the difference between emotional intensity and emotional safety. You become more aware of how much energy was going into uncertainty management, reading tone shifts, interpreting silence, adjusting yourself to maintain connection. Once you're no longer doing that, you don't just miss the person in the same way. You start seeing the cost of staying more clearly than the fear of leaving. That's also where self-respect becomes less of an idea and more of an experience. It stops being about affirmations or decisions made in the heat of emotion and starts becoming a quiet internal consistency. You don't have to convince yourself that you deserve better. You simply become less willing to abandon your own needs for the sake of keeping proximity. And something important shifts in how you relate to closure. Instead of waiting for understanding or validation from the other person, you start recognizing that closure often doesn't arrive as a conversation. It arrives as a gradual internal settling where the need for answers loses its urgency. The mind still remembers, but it stops treating the past as something it has to resolve in order to move forward. What remains after that is not a perfect emotional resolution, but a different kind of baseline. One where connection is no longer measured by effort alone, but by reciprocity, consistency, and emotional safety. And once you've felt the difference between those states clearly, it becomes much harder to confuse intensity with intimacy again. What often comes next is a quieter but more important shift. Your attention starts moving away from "what did they feel about me" toward "what did I become inside that dynamic?" That question can feel uncomfortable at first because it removes the focus from the other person as the main source of meaning, but it's also where real integration starts happening. In relationships marked by inconsistency, many people begin to shape themselves around maintaining connection rather than expressing themselves fully. You might notice you became more careful with your words, more alert to mood changes, more willing to delay your own needs in order to keep things stable. None of that usually happens consciously. It builds slowly through repetition until it feels like your natural way of relating. When the connection ends or goes silent, those adaptations don't disappear immediately. You can still find yourself overthinking messages that never come, or feeling small waves of anxiety when your mind expects contact that doesn't arrive. That isn't attachment to the person as much as it is your system adjusting to the absence of a pattern it learned to anticipate. Your mind was doing its job, trying to maintain predictability in something that was often unpredictable. As time goes on, something subtle begins to shift. You start noticing that your emotional energy is no longer being consumed by interpretation. There's more space between thoughts, less urgency in checking, analyzing, or replaying. In that space, you begin to reconnect with parts of yourself that were always there but were not getting much attention: your preferences, your pace, your emotional boundaries, your natural way of being when you are not adjusting to someone else's fluctuations. This is also where emotional contrast becomes very clear. You don't just remember the good moments or the difficult ones. You start recognizing the pattern itself as the most defining feature. The inconsistency stops feeling like something you can mentally solve and starts feeling like something you don't need to re-enter in order to understand. And without forcing it, your standards start recalibrating. Not in a dramatic, "I will never tolerate this again" kind of way, but in a quieter internal refusal to confuse uncertainty with depth. You become more sensitive to consistency, more aware of emotional effort that feels mutual rather than one-directional, more attuned to how your body responds in the presence of steadiness versus unpredictability. Eventually, what used to feel like longing for answers turns into something simpler, a preference for clarity over complexity. And from that place, your decisions and future connections don't come from pain or reaction, but from recognition. After that stage, what usually develops is a more grounded form of emotional intelligence, the kind that doesn't come from reading books or advice, but from lived experience. You start to recognize patterns earlier, not in a hypervigilant or anxious way, but in a calm, almost observational way. You can feel when something is beginning to require too much interpretation to feel safe, and that recognition alone becomes enough information. One of the most important changes is that your tolerance for ambiguity decreases, but not because you become rigid or closed off. It decreases because you've already experienced what prolonged ambiguity does to your emotional stability. You remember what it feels like to constantly fill in gaps, to over-explain inconsistency, to turn confusion into something you can emotionally survive. And because of that memory, you become less willing to enter situations where clarity is repeatedly postponed. At the same time, your emotional reactivity starts to soften. Things that would have previously triggered spirals, delayed replies, sudden distance, mixed signals, begin to land differently. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop immediately assigning meaning to everything. There is a growing gap between stimulus and interpretation, and in that gap, you regain choice. You can observe something without automatically turning it into a story about your worth or your place in someone's life. This is also where you begin to understand the difference between attachment and alignment. Attachment pulls you toward what is familiar, even when it is unstable. Alignment feels more neutral, but it is steady. One demands constant emotional labor to maintain connection. The other feels like you can exist without shrinking or overextending. Once you've experienced both, even briefly, your system starts to distinguish between what is emotionally intense and what is actually emotionally nourishing. And slowly, your definition of connection begins to simplify. It becomes less about potential, less about what someone could be if things improved, and more about what is consistently present. You stop organizing your emotional investment around possibility and start anchoring it in reality. That shift alone changes the entire way you relate because it removes the gap where fantasy and hope used to do most of the work. From there, life doesn't feel like a constant emotional puzzle anymore. It feels more direct, not always easier, but clearer. And clarity, once you've learned to trust it, becomes something you naturally return to whenever things start to feel like they require too much emotional translation to sustain.